In progress.
Howard.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Howard. Can you see and hear me?
I can see and hear you, and we're about to go live. We have on Zoom about 400 people watching us already, and hundreds more on YouTube and Facebook.
Just sort this out while you do chatting to the panelists.
Okay, and Danny, if you can take us live, please. Well, good evening to everyone. The time is 6:45 on a relatively chilly Joburg night. Michael Lewis, welcome from New York. Nice to see you.
Very much. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Let me introduce you to some of the people that you see on the panel. That cold-looking person with the interesting sweat shirt is Benji Porter, Vice Chair of the South African Jewish Report.
Very nice to meet you, Benji.
And next to him is Sean Matheson. Hello, Sean.
Hey, Sean.
Hi.
And Herschel Jarvis of the very famed Jarvis Property Group is the other well-haired gentleman that you see.
Michael. Hi, nice to meet you.
We have Peter Cross-Maunder, the editor of the South African Jewish Report, who's looking very zhuzh in her new hairstyle today. Peter, I presume you're not going to the hairdresser. I certainly hope you're doing that yourself.
This is all me, Howard. I have skills, apparently, other than being a journalist.
all natural. Dina Diamond adds to our female contingent. Dina, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, lovely to add to the female contingent. I feel Peter may have been outnumbered over here.
So how is the new addition to the Diamond family?
Isabella Rose is doing fantastically, growing at a rapid pace.
That's marvelous. We have David Zardel from Ort who's joining us this evening to talk a little about entrepreneurship. And Simon, that's something you certainly know a lot about Ort on your side. I trust you joining us from Cape Town.
I'm joining from Cape Town.
And Ort is something very close to your heart.
I'm involved in Ort in Cape Town. So there we go.
And we have Philip Krawitz joining us as well. Philip, why are all our panelists tonight Cape Town?
I think it's something in the blood of the Cape Townians. We have to try hard to survive.
No, it's because we all have to obey Philip. That's the real reason.
Well, everyone watching us, and we have a huge audience tonight across Zoom, across YouTube, and across Facebook as well. And there are multiple thousands of people who will be watching us this evening. And everyone will know that tonight is in fact the 100th webinar that we're running since lockdown began. And Benji, if I remember correctly, it was your and Sean's idea to do this right in the beginning. We're sitting in a board meeting in my offices in the days when we still had offices, and you said, why don't we run a webinar?
You know how you give me that credit, but I think it's a bit overstated, because I think together we were discussing how do we serve the community at this crazy time, and I think together as the beautiful board that we are, and it really is, plainly not in looks, because you can see all of us other than Dina, but the constructive board that we are, that we started this program, and how we to talk about it in any other form than it's been kind of driven and led by your brilliance would be a complete injustice. So that's the first part of it. But I think we were going to do one. And then we decided to do, we're going to do one and inform the community.
A medical one to make sure that people knew what to do with their shoes when they came in from shopping during COVID. And
exactly.
When there were no cases.
There were no cases yet. We thought no one would arrive, and thousands of people arrived. So, Sean, what has been your favorite webinar that we've done of the 100?
Favorite one? That's a tough one.
Sean, you can't choose your own way. You have to choose someone else's.
I think it was the one on reading, Sean.
That was a personal favorite. No, the one for sure was the Mossad spy. That if you ask me to pick one, I will pick that one.
Sylvia, the Mossad spy has been watched now in excess of more than 50,000 times between all the channels that we broadcast on. Herschel, you're not allowed to choose Sylvia, the Mossad spy. Give us one of your favorites.
Howie, I think probably the singing ones. You know, it's been a challenging year, and we've had lots of kind of heavy issues to report on and bring to our audience. So I think that we've had the opportunity to bring the singers like Khoni G and Benji, who's the Chazonas from Sydenham.
Truworths.
No, who does beautiful operas. I think when we've had a time to lift the community and just bring some lightness and some comedy and some music, I think those have been a welcome break to the challenges and the seriousness of the last 12 months.
Okay, Peter, what are your thoughts? What have you enjoyed most?
I would say the Achberg children was incredibly moving. It was fascinating because although I knew about the Achberg kids, to actually hear people talking about their experiences and their family's experience, to me, was amazing. Very special.
Dina, from you?
So they've given the spy and the Achberg. So can I actually just say one that I was involved with was the one with the women in leadership, the women of power. And I think that one was amazing. I think that because we just got to showcase such amazing women that we have in our community, that for me, they blew me away. So I think that was a great one. And
remind us who we had on that one.
So on that particular panel, we had Jill Marcus, we had Sharon Wapnick, we had Dion Ellerin, we had Dawn Nathan Jones, and it was just amazing.
And Wendy Applebaum, don't forget.
Oh, sorry, of course, and Wendy Applebaum and Valerie Mizrahi. So, a powerhouse of women like that you don't get every day, and those women don't just agree to be on webinars. So we had to literally pull them and get them onto that webinar, and all of their stories are fascinating, and they all have achieved so much that for me it was massively inspiring. So I loved that webinar.
Can I name two just before we ask some of our other guests?
But not ones that you've been on. How is that?
That speaks about one.
That can't speak out about 96 of the 100 so far. But I love the one we did on ISIS in Africa, because we were talking about ISIS in Mozambique 6 months before the big attacks and before it came onto everyone else's webinars. And that, Peter, that was one that you and I did together. And that was amazing. And I also love, do you remember our L'chaim, a toast to the people of South Africa, that we did with Goldfish coming from New York and Lera, who was in Namibia at the time. And we sang Jabulani, and we had all of these South African superstars, Majozi, all over, all drinking a toast and a L'chaim to the people of South Africa. And it's absolutely one of my favorite. Of course, before we ask David next, and then I'm going to ask Philip about their favorites one. Our biggest one so far has actually been the broadcast of Jewish Achiever Awards, which has had approximately 60,000 people watching. Now, if you think about it, Benji, Ellis Park, how many people does Ellis Park seat? About 60,000.
Around there.
And probably Newlands Cricket Stadium, half that.
Yeah, probably.
So Dave Zardel, you've watched a few of ours. What have you enjoyed?
I've only watched about 80 of the 100.
We'll forgive you. It's
The
okay.
80-20 rule. So I've just got to say, for me personally, this has been unbelievable to take it on. And I think having the idea that Benji had initially to do it, and that's the beauty of it. You start with one and then it grows. And I think you as a host have been unbelievable in all of these. The enthusiasm and it just, you're a natural. You're just a natural at this. So I don't know if I should say, but kola COVID or kola kavod.
Definitely not.
I haven't heard that one yet. I love that.
Phil, have you been watching a few of these along the way?
Absolutely, very few that I missed. But you know, there's a lovely definition I used to use when I taught students on entrepreneurship, and it was very simple. Entrepreneurship is an unreasonable commitment based on insufficient evidence. And that's exactly what you did, Howard. That's exactly what you did. With insufficient evidence, you made this total commitment, and it's been fantastic. You know, we learn Ezo hu chacham hu lomed mikol adam. And what is what are we saying? We say, who's the one who is wise? The one who is wise is the one who learns from others. And I think all of us have learned so much through these webinars. So really, kol hakavod to you, kol hakavod to the team. I've watched many of them, and I think that they are absolutely outstanding. And there's not one that I can walk away from without saying, wow, I didn't learn anything. Every one I was able to walk away and say, wow, I never knew that before. So really, kol hakavod, keep it up.
Well, I think we've probably had 500 guests on our webinar so far, and we think we've been watched about 800,000 times since we began. Benji, I never asked you about your favorite.
You know, Howie, I'm going to skip that question, and I'm going to say actually what I've learned from it. I love that definition, Philip. But, you know, we meet every Monday at 3:30, and what I've absolutely loved is that there's been the only focus is how do we serve a community. And I had three things that I've learned from this. One is the benefit of having a clear focus of serving. I know personally I've learned so much from each of the guests. I endorse what David says about you being the host, but I've learned so much. But actually the biggest lesson that I've learned is that it's the most favorable responses that we've got from any type of guest is the most authentic people, that the rehearsed and the very well manicured and all of those sort of things has received, like, let's call it reasonable feedback, but authenticity. I know the other night we had a really authentic moment from in one of the webinars, and we received such brilliant feedback about just authenticity and this need for everything to be perfect. Actually on a live broadcast just falls away, and that's been so inspiring for me. So Philip, I love that definition. I'm going to listen to the recording and write it down. But I think that, along with just being authentic and this authentic need to serve a community, has been such an inspiring thing. And I really hold it dear, and I hold it dear to the entire team, Peter and you, Howie, and Sean and Hirsch and Dina and the entire Jewish Report team, that we can just learn from that, just being authentic selves and taking unreasonable steps to serve a community. It's been one of the greatest things I've been involved in. So I don't know if that helps, Howie.
Of recent times, I've absolutely loved on our June the 16th webinar when Dr. Edelstein's daughters were talking about the murder of their father, and you had people who were students in 76 who knew the story, who were coming on and just being so authentic themselves and apologizing to the Edelstein daughters and saying, we knew about your father. He was an amazing man. We're so sorry for what happened. But the other thing, Benji, that I think is quite clear, and it's something that I learned from one of our webinars from your wife, who was on one of our webinars talking about culture beats strategy any day. And she said one of the things that we've done during COVID is we've learned to live with imperfection.
Yeah.
That's what we
we know that's part of, because she got married to me 24 years ago. She had to really learn how to live with imperfection.
So let us say good evening to Gareth Ackerman, who's just joined us this evening. Gareth, good evening.
Good evening. Nice to be with you.
Were you on the beach today in Cape Town?
No way.
I heard it was decent weather, and Philip earlier was showing us his sunset through his window. It looked absolutely spectacular.
No, I went to the beach yesterday afternoon. It was magnificent. But Cape Town is wonderful at the moment.
Oh, you make us in the northern part of the country enormously jealous. So we're going to go live in 1 minute's time, and we always just have a very informal chat just before we go live. And tonight we wanted to talk informally about 100 webinars that has led us to this point in time, but we can't have Danny and Britt with their cameras off. So guys, please turn your cameras on and tell us about your favorite webinars. Nice headphones there, Danny.
Thank you. It's a bit of a game changer. I'm becoming all tech savvy. Howard, there's been so many, besides for the time that the finance minister tried to arrive on stage in one of our webinars, and none of us could let him in because the entire Zoom room was actually filled up. But I just have to actually comment on something which is quite hysterical, is that having gone to Dis-Chem, and I should have known better going to Dis-Chem and Bluebird and trying to be, inconspicuous. And the chemist has got her eyes like wide open, and she goes, "Are you the guy from the Jewish Report webinars?" And I'm like, "I am." And if I got that, I can't imagine what Howard you go through on a daily basis. I mean, you must need an actual security escort to get through these places. I mean, that's
Danny, I haven't left my home in 15 months. I wouldn't know.
And that's almost a Kardashian.
but my favorite moment when we finally did have the finance minister on was when he, number one, gave us his pilchards recipe, and number two, Simon, I don't know if you've ever stocked any of his pilchards in any of your stores, but second of all, when we asked him, didn't we just waste 10 billion rand on SAA, and his response was, some birds are chickens, some birds are ducks, and some birds are flamingos, and some are meant to fly and some are not meant to fly. So Britt, very quickly, just before we begin, tell us what your favorite webinar of the last 100 has been.
Sure, it's so difficult to choose just one. It really is. But I think that's the most amazing part of our webinars is the 1 week that we didn't have a webinar, and how many emails and phone calls and WhatsApps we actually got to say, I didn't see the link, what is going on? So I think that was more fascinating to me, that the one night off, everyone just was like completely shocked and didn't know what to do with themselves for the evening.
Well, the time has just gone 2 minutes past 7, and a huge welcome to everyone who's joined us around the world this evening. You will see that the Zoom room is basically full. So if you do know of anyone trying to get in, please send them to either our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. But it's very seldom that we've actually filled the Zoom room to complete capacity. And that's really a credit to these remarkable panelists that we have on tonight. But before we get on to our panelists, I just want to say a huge thank you to the board of the South African Jewish Report. Tonight is our 100th webinar, and it all began on how do we serve our community. And our first webinar was doctors giving us advice. What do you do with your shopping when you bring it in from the supermarket as COVID was beginning? What do you do with your shoes? Do you take your clothes off? At that point in time, we knew nothing. We didn't even know about masks. We didn't know about social distancing. We didn't know anything. And we thought a few hundred people would arrive, and a few thousand people arrived. And so we went on to psychologists and nutritionists and yoga experts and health gurus and comedians and musicians and entertainers and storytellers. And we've covered amazing gambit from Sean, the sort of stuff that you've done on education and reading. Herschel, the way you've managed to bring things like Iron Dome into our living rooms, and most recently, the bereaved parents of Israelis and Palestinians who spoke about the need for peace in the Middle East. It's been so amazing. Dino, the way you have galvanized people, and you have taught people who've never been into a kitchen how to cook for Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah, and to do these amazing webinars, home improvements. And Benji, let's talk about the way we actually joined the Jewish world together on Rosh Hashanah and on Pesach, where we got rabbis and chazonim from South America and North America and Europe and Australia, creating the Jewish people together. It is truly so astounding what we've managed to do. And Peter, we've taken the big news items of the day and we've made them relevant in people's lives. So on behalf of the South African Jewish Report, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for the other 99 webinars that we've done since lockdown has begun. And if I can ask you just for a minute in the chat section, whether you're watching on Zoom or Facebook or on YouTube, just give us your favorite webinar that you've watched over the last 100 and give us a few moments and recollections of what you have and why you've enjoyed and stuck with us, because we believe that over the last 100 webinars that the South African Jewish Report has run, we believe that in excess of 800,000 people have watched us over the last 15 months of lockdown. So thank you to the board of the Jewish Report. Thank you to Britt and Danny, who tonight will be on controls. Danny, you'll be playing all the videos. Britt, you'll be looking at chats and comments that are coming in on YouTube and Facebook and moving them over to this section as well. And Hirsch, we can't tell people, but we got an enormously exciting webinar coming up on Saturday night. We think it will be very entertainment. Can't tell people what it's about, but if you start singing, I'm sure you'll be talking about silver magic ships.
Yeah.
For a Hirsch, come on.
Sugar man, won't you drink that?
I am going to ask, just before the board turns off their cameras, I'm just going to ask each member of the board to select a number between 1 and 288, because we're going to draw some winners tonight in our patron campaign. So Benji, give us a number between 1 and 288.
8.
Sorry, what number?
8.
8. Hirsch, give me a number.
66.
Dina, give me a number.
132.
132. Sean, give me a number.
201.
201. And we need one more. So Peter, that one goes to you. One number between 1 and 288.
55.
55. We will announce the winners of our patron campaign a little later this evening. So thank you guys for joining us. Just before we kick off, Dave, we're going to be talking to some of the greatest entrepreneurs in South Africa tonight. And Ort has been involved in entrepreneurship for so long. Give us a little sense of what Ort is doing and how, in fact, we're building entrepreneurs in our community, and how can people go for help?
Right. Thank you, Howie. I'm trying to share my screen. I hope you can see it.
We can indeed.
Fantastic. So, as you might know, I always have a little play on words. So instead of the great Jewish retailers, we're dealing with the retailers. And what we're doing is that just promoting what Ort does, because I think a lot of people need to use the services that Ort give. I volunteer for Ort, and it's an unbelievable service that they're providing, and people don't know that it's available. And what it really is one is a business mentor service. So they have, well, I call it the retailers. It's people who've been successful in business who are now giving back to the community. And it's available for anybody who's running a business. It doesn't have to be a business that is in trouble. It could be a business that is successful and they just want to be more successful. They might want to open a franchise and have no idea how to open a franchise type business. And so we'll link you to somebody, to a mentor who's already done that, who will help with that. That's the one aspect. The next one is what we call Jetflix. There are a lot of webinars that a lot of the facilitators have given. I give one on behavioral economics, the psychology of business. There are others who give it on how to use LinkedIn, how to do Facebook marketing. So there are a lot of those that you will have access to and be able to watch these webinars that can help you with the business. And then we have the in the boardroom discussions. Simon Susman has been a guest of ours on that. We've had some great business people who we ask them what was successful, how did they become successful in business. But the key point, and the point I want to get across, is anybody who's watching this, who is involved in a business or wants to get involved in a business, doesn't know how to start, there are mentors available. There are unbelievable people available to help you. Some of the achievements that Ortjet has done, and I'm in awe of this. As I say, I'm just volunteer, and they chose me, I think, the same way as you chose those numbers. They picked a number out the box and said, David, just present on our behalf. They've got access to 41 facilitators, different people who facilitate like myself, but there are over 300 mentors in the database. So whatever business you're in, they can find people to help with that. At the moment, they're helping 135 different businesses. And as you can see the numbers there, there's training sessions, there's a whole lot of different stuff that they do. There are 2 main offices. The one is in Joburg, the other one's in Cape Town. If you're based in Durban, we'll help you there as well. Some of the names of the companies that you might know that we have helped, Gelatissimo. That kind of rolls off my tongue, but it rolls better onto my tongue. It's one of the best ice creams I've ever tasted. And there are a number of others, Voodoo Lily, etc. The president of Ort is Brian Joffe, needs no introduction, and Simon is the chairman of Ort Cape Town. So I'm going to be putting in the chat Helene's contacts. So if anybody wants to make use of the service, please contact Helene and she will take it forward. It is just, especially now when people are changing jobs, the worst thing is having a great idea and not knowing what to do with it. So Howie, I just want to thank you and the Juice Report for this opportunity just to allow us to tell people about this, because the worst thing is if you're giving a great service, a great opportunity, and no one knows about it. And thanks to you and speaking to so many people who are watching, maybe there's somebody out there who will be the next leader and the next great retailer in the country. So thank you, Howard.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for joining us this evening. Just a reminder as well that the latest edition of the South African Juice Report is out. You can go into any of the retailers who are on tonight. Gareth, you distribute the Juice Report through Pick and Pay throughout South Africa. I don't think we're in any of your boxes stores, but absolutely go into a Pick and Pay, go into a Woolworths, go into a Dis-Chem, go into a Checkers, go into your local garage shop, your shul, your school, and pick up the latest edition of the South African Juice Report, your Dis-Chem as well. Also, if you're unable to do that, don't forget you can go to www.sajr.co.za and you can either download the entire edition there, or alternatively, you can look at each of the individual articles. And a huge thank you tonight to Kim Tobias, the cook sister, who baked us a 100th anniversary webinar cake. So to the cook sister, to Kim Tobias, you did something absolutely beautiful and magnificent. Danny, show us the cake that Kim designed for us, please.
You could love that.
Kimmy, thank you so much. That is the most awesome cake. See, and her talents got to be shared with the whole of South Africa and the globe. So we are so grateful. It's amazing.
That's the cook sister, Kim Tobias, with the amazing cake that she did for everyone, and I'll distribute all of the slices tomorrow.
Now, Howie, before you carry on, you've thanked everyone, but I think that we actually just have to thank you, because obviously we all do our little bits, but you are our fearless leader and you show so much commitment. I don't think people know how much work goes into absolutely every single webinar, hours and hours, and sometimes days and days, putting it all together. And you never waver, you keep going. Some of us get tired and you're like, no, what are we doing this week? and you literally make us all carry on. So thank you, reluctantly sometimes, but thank you for pushing us, for making us do what we do, and for all the work and effort that you do put in, because it is a love, it is a passion. As you say, you don't get paid for it, but it is just something you are absolutely committed to and give your full and your all to. So thank you so much from the board and from everyone who watches. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us this evening. But they weren't here to listen to me or you guys. They were here to listen to 4 of the greatest retailers that have ever existed. And we're going to start with Simon Susman. Simon, good evening. Welcome.
Howard, how are you?
Fantastic. Wonderful to see you this evening. People know your brand. People love your brand. Woolworths is the heart and soul of almost our entire community, and certainly a big chunk of our credit card spend. But how did it all begin?
So I'll tell you the story, Howard. But before I tell, I was listening to all this about the webcasts and your Mossad speaker. Many of you would have known of my father, who was a retailer of note and a community member of note. But what you wouldn't have known is that he was a member of the Mossad. And he was a member of Mossad just after the War of Independence. So I was born in Israel. And I think when my mother was pregnant, father was in the Mossad. And he was, the peak of his career in Mossad was there was a very suspicious priest who was wandering around Tel Aviv looking suspicious all the time, and father was delegated to follow the priest, and he followed him for 2 weeks expecting to find this unbelievable spy story, and came back and told his bosses that the priest was visiting the ladies of the night. So that was far. He was better as a shopkeeper than he was as a spy. So how did Willie start? So I looked at your panel, Howard, and I thought, we're all 3rd or 4th generation. How incredible is that? That our fathers or our grandfathers, or in my case, our great-grandfather, started these unbelievable businesses. So we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we always stand on the shoulders of giants, but none more so than your panel tonight. So I'm going to tell a little story about 3 families. I'm going to talk about the Marxes and the Siefs. That's one family. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sonnenbergs, and I'm going to talk about the Susmans. Why I talk about Marks and Spencer is that much of what Woolworths stands for and has stood for now for almost 90 years comes from Marks and Spencer, and in particular from the family. So Michael Marks, my great-grandfather, I think there's a fly flying in front of you, Howard.
Could be.
Seems to have gone. My great-grandfather, Michael Marks, was an immigrant, arrived in England, not a penny to his name, couldn't speak English. And he arrived in a town called Hull, or as the locals call it, Ulm. And he wandered around the town looking for somebody who looked after and cared for immigrant Jews, whose name was Mr. Barron. And of all people, he stops on the bridge, a man, and in sort of sign language says to him, "Do you know where Mr. Barron can be found?" And the guy on the bridge looks him up and down and says, "No, I don't know this guy, Barron. What do you want him for?" My great-grandfather, Michael Marks, says in sign language, "I want to borrow some money to start a business." And the guy looks him up and down again. It says to him, "Follow me." And he takes him to his little warehouse and he gives him a tray of goods. Now, in the tray of goods is sewing needles, threads, buttons, thimbles, all sorts of little stuff for haberdashery. And he says to Michael Marks in sign language, "Michael, young man, go and sell these, come back and I'll give you another tray." And Michael starts to sell these goods. But because he can't speak English, he has a problem negotiating price with all his customers. And in the end, he works out a good idea and he puts a sign on the tray. Don't ask the price, it's a penny. So everything that he sells is for a penny. That is the origin of Marks and Spencer. And indeed, for 30 years, it was called Marx's Penny Bazaar. And so what we talk about with that is that when you sell everything for one price, and we don't do it anymore today, when you sell anything for one price, you'd better make sure that you squeeze value into that penny like there's no tomorrow. So quality better be good, value better be good, presentation had better be good. That is the genesis of the Marks and Spencer business and later became the genesis of the Woolies business. So Michael moved on, his son Simon, after whom I was named, took over the business. And Simon really created Marks and Spencer into the modern business it is today. And he started opening, they moved from trays to tables to market stalls and eventually to proper shops. And I'm reminded, although I don't think it applied to Marks and Spencer, of the Jewish trader who opened a store and was doing very, very well. And next door to him, a new guy comes and opens up the store and he puts a big sign over the door, says, cheapest prices. And our little fellow's trade drops off a bit, but he can survive. Until next door on the other side, another trader opens and he puts above his door highest quality. So he's got one bloke on the left, cheapest prices, one on the right saying highest quality. He's in the middle and business is terrible until he puts a sign above his door that says entrance. His business suddenly becomes remarkably good. So that's nothing to do with anything except that that is how shopkeepers think. That is how Michael Marks thinks. That is how his son Simon thought. Simon built the business up during the early years pre the First World War through to the Second World War. And after the Second World War, we now come to the second family, which is the Sonnenberg family. Max Sonnenberg was a remarkable entrepreneur. He came from, I think, Vicksburg, somewhere in the Northern Cape. He was a politician, he was an entrepreneur, he was a negotiator. He moved to Cape Town and was asked by a fishing company, like a predecessor of Irvin and Johnson, to go to London and buy some trawlers. This is in 1930-31. So he goes to London, he buys the trawlers, and he meets in London a wholesaler who says to him, listen, you come from South Africa. I have an unbelievable business in Australia. I export goods to Australia. The name of the company in Australia is called Woolworths. It's nothing to do with FW Woolworths. It's just a good copy of the name, and they're doing unbelievably well. So, Mr. Sonnenberg, why don't, if I send them 10 cups and saucers, why don't I send you one? And would you mind calling your company Woolworths, because then I don't have to change any labels. So the origin of Woolies today, this deeply principled business, is plagiarism. So we all have our little skeletons in the cupboard, but that's how we got our name. And thanks to Mr. Max Sonnenberg's entrepreneurship, so Woolies was founded. And Woolies in the beginning sold goods that no one else had seen in South Africa and did extraordinarily well, even through the war years. But at the end of the war years, it was getting a bit more difficult. At the same time, Simon Marks, then Sir Simon, was summoned by Winston Churchill and asked by Churchill to invest in the colonies. Now, we're not allowed to use the word colonies today, but Marx was told, invest in the colonies. They are the source of our future wealth. Max Sonnenberg got on a boat, went to London, he heard about this, and he persuaded Simon Marks to buy 20% of Woolies. That was in 1947. So now you have the first link between Woolies and Marks and Spencer. Simon Marks had never been to Africa, let alone South Africa, let alone seen Woolies. But he bought 20% of the business. He then came out to look at this business on a ship with an entourage. And in the entourage was his niece. And his niece, those of you in Cape Town will know well, my dear mother. So when Mr. Sonnenberg found out that my mother, the young niece, was on the boat, he said to his neighbor, who was my grandfather, Eli, you've just joined Woolworths. Your son is hanging around here somewhere. Get him to look after the bloody niece. And that is where my mother and my father met. And that is where the relationship between Marks and Spencer and Woolworths was cemented. Time moved on. Woolies was doing okay. My father went to work in Marks and Spencer and studied after his time in Israel, studied how they operated their business and their world, but was summoned one day to Mr. Simon's office and told that business that your father's involved with is a dreck business. Sells rubbish, nothing to be proud of, doesn't make any money, and I'm going to sell my 20% shares. So my father, evidently aged 26, protested wildly and said, it's not fair, Sir Simon. You've done nothing to help that business. You should send a crack team of guys out. It's an amazing opportunity. Simon, who was a very tiny little man, looked at him, pointed his finger at him and said, oh, you go. And that in 1952 is how my father, and at the time, my very unwilling mother, came to South Africa. In fact, she was so upset, she went to Simon Marks and said, how can you tear me away from my family? He said, I'll send you a magazine every month. That will keep you happy. So I used to read the London Illustrated News as a child, never understood the genesis of it. But come 1952, my father came back to Woolworths and started to make Woolworths into this deeply principled, quality, value-based organization. And indeed, they started with the apparel business, narrowed the ranges down, and much of the South African clothing industry actually grew up around Woolies in those early days. So the first bit of making Woolies a business of quality came from that deep Marks and Spencer influence that my father had and how he was able to stamp it on the organization and on the industry around him. And in those days, we competed with, Bazaars, I've no doubt, Philip, we competed with you. Foschini was around, we competed with whatever Foschini was doing then. Gareth, we were probably competing with your grandfather, but not yet with your father. But it was wonderful days. The economy was growing, and Woolies established this principle of quality. I then joined the business at the end of 1982, and I'd been sent, I went to Marks and Spencer to start my retail career. I spent 11 years with M&S and ended up as the assistant to the chairman. And the chairman at that stage was a remarkable man, Lord Seif. So I was Marcus Seif's assistant, and that meant you were scheduled for a very great career in the business. And I promptly resigned and came back here. So anyway, I was given the food business to build, and indeed that's what I set out to do. But at the time, food was a tiny part of Woolworths. And I was listening, Philip, to you earlier talking about entrepreneurship. I don't know how many times I was told we're going to shut this bloody food business. It's a waste of time. Doesn't make any money. Nobody wants to produce for you. You're doing this, then you're doing that, then you're doing the other, because we did whatever we could do because Gareth's father was literally eating our breakfast. Gareth, your dad did terrible things. He made his goods cheaper. He gave his customers parking. He made the consumer king. It was all sorts of things that were terribly unfair, and we had to compete against all of those. But bit by bit, we managed to get the business sorted, and it became, and the only way we could compete was not to compete with Raymond. We just couldn't. So we developed our own private label business. And that was kind of the genesis of the Woolies business. But we did wonderful things. We persuaded the fishing industry to change how their trawlers did the trawling. We persuaded the vegetable industry to change how they were growing the lettuces, because the lettuces all had mud on them and things like that. And there are wonderful stories like that, but there is a sweet story a little bit more recently about the lettuce. So we got a phone call in head office a few years ago. Customer says, I have a frog in my lettuce. And if you don't sort this out, I'm going to the newspapers. Now, you actually don't want to hear that you have a frog in the lettuce and put that in the newspapers. So we sent 15 people out to her house, gave her 3 free lettuces or whatever we did at the time. And she said, no. The frog is still alive. Where does the lettuce come from? It's a Cape Town customer. So we did our homework, looked at the supplier details. It came from Mpumalanga. She says, take the frog back to Mpumalanga. So we thought she wanted the free lettuce. So she wanted the frog to be taken home. So we did get somebody to get on a plane with this frog in a box. He had to go up to Mpumalanga, go to the field, release the frog, take a photograph, give the photograph back to the customer. I can only think the frog with his mates that night was saying, I've just been to Woolworths, I've just been to Cape Town, it's so beautiful, I don't know why they sent me back here, but we had to send the frog back to Mpumalanga. So the message behind that is you never quite know what your relationship with your customers are, but you better follow what they want you to do. So that was the frog. We then developed over the years, and I'm nearly finished, Howard, because I know my time is up, this, I think, pivotal concept called the good business journey. And the good business journey was came from a sense that if we were going to continue to grow and trade, we needed to be good citizens, very good citizens. And many of our competitors were starting to think in the same way. And that good citizenship meant being good to our community, being good to our customers, being good to our people, and being good to the environment. And to this day, it still forms the foundation of Woolworths' ethos, the good business journey. We're reducing plastic like most people are. Our carbon footprint is continuously dropping. Our people, we help to build careers for them. But it's been the guiding light. And I think it's a really powerful thing for Woolies. And it stood the test of time, and it keeps us thinking ahead of time. So that's been one of the things I'm slightly proud of as well. And I'll finish, Howard, with a little story of the good business journey. I'm the only one here who's retired, by the way. So I can tell stories of when I was. So when I stepped down as chief executive and was now the chairman, I went into one of the rural stores and I thought, okay, nobody's going to recognize me. I always do the shopping. So I believe you want to be a shopkeeper, do the shopping. So I do the shopping twice a week. And I walked into the store and I did the food shopping. And I get to the checkout and the lady at the checkout says to me, would you like a plastic bag, sir? And this is at the height of us having launched this good business journey. So I said, yes, thank you. I'd love a plastic bag. She says, are you sure? And I said, yeah, I'm sure. She says, are you really sure? now I'm starting to get a bit irritated. Checkout lady's questioning a customer. The customer's made a decision. I said, yes, I'm really sure. Why are you asking me? She says, sir, you of all people should not be using a plastic bag. So at that point, I was very deeply humbled and understood that the message had got right through the system. Because sometimes we get humbled, and that was a magical moment for me. So Howard, that's my story in brief, and it's a bit of a woolly story, and I'm happy to take questions now or later.
Well, there are a few questions coming in. Someone has asked, no mention of Ellie and Harry Susman.
Well, Eli was my grandfather. So Eli was he was the neighbor of Mr. Sonnenberg. That's how he joined Woolworths. So I'll tell a little story about him. Eli and Harry arrived in Cape Town in the 1880s, 1890s, and they worked as barmen, and they managed to get themselves up to what is today Botswana, where they again were working in an inn. And in the inn, these two little Jewish boys who could only just speak English, they heard of the buried treasure that was only a couple of 100 miles to the north, real treasure. So they rented an ox wagon and went north right into what is now Western Zambia, Barotse land, to find the treasure. Well, of course, there was no treasure, but they met the Lutunga, who was the king of Barotse land, who took a liking to them, and they started a trading empire in Western Zambia, which then spread throughout Zambia, in which my cousin John, I think, still has a share in a farm in Zambia. And it was an unbelievable business based on this principle of the king said to his people, you can trade with the Susmans because you can trust the Susmans. It's the same set of values that filter down. Eli they were the first people to settle north of the Zambezi River in the little town of Livingston. And the bridge was built in 1900 something. And then Eli retired and moved to Muizenberg and ended up next door to Max Sonnenberg. And Eli was bored stiff. And Max said to him, Woolworths is doing very nicely, thank you. Why don't you go and start the Johannesburg store instead of coming around to Kibitz with me every night? So that's how my grandfather got into Woolworths. He went up to Johannesburg and opened Kirk Street Woolworths. He died when I was young. Harry, I never really knew. Harry was his brother, and Harry was physically a tough guy. They both had to be tough. They were living in the bush for 30 years. They both got malaria and worse. And once a truck fell on my grandfather, Eli, and Harry lifted this little truck off his brother to rescue him. And thereafter was known as the Wild Bull of Barotse land. So that's their story.
So Simon, another question that's come in says, was your dad not involved in the liberation of Lod in 1948?
My father kept trying to be a student at university and never quite succeeded at that, but joined up with the South African Army, first of all, and fought briefly in North Africa and then in the Italian campaign. So he learned how to be a good soldier and finished that, and then went to try and go to university. And then the War of Liberation broke out in 1948. And he joined up as one of the volunteers. I think there were 804 of them, he and his close friend, Jeffrey Perlman. And they went and fought in the Israeli War of Independence. And father was wounded in the Israeli War of Independence. In fact, he was shot in the back and it came out of his neck. And those of you that knew him would have seen a scar on the back of his neck. So he was wounded in that War of Independence. I found in his files, or mother found in his files, typed out sheets of daily instructions. Take hill number 403, only use 4 men. Protect Donga, whatever the word for Donga was, to the west, only use 8 men. Do this by 9:15 a.m. So yes, he was a soldier in Israel in the volunteer group that came from South Africa. And so then became this Mossad agent to track the priest.
You'll be amazed to hear that Howard Chait has written to say the story of the frog is true. My wife, Michelle, called Woolies about the frog in the letters.
I'm amazed.
Simon, I have 2 more questions. Give us a sense today. How big is Woolworths? Where does it operate? How many staff? Where in the world do we find the Woolworths and the associated brands that are now part of the Woolworths group?
So we operate mainly in South Africa and Australia. There are a little over 40,000 people in the group, spread between the bulk of them in South Africa, but others in Australia. We have stores throughout the rest of Africa. That's been a challenge. We were as far north as Nigeria and exited Nigeria, and then more recently Ghana. But we do well in countries like Kenya, Mozambique, extremely well in Botswana and in Namibia. And then we bought, my predecessor bought a magical business called Country Road in Australia. And Sid Muller was passionate about buying Country Road. It reflected everything that Woolies reflected. So it reflected quality, it reflected modernity, it reflected values. And it was our first venture, not just offshore, but into an acquisition. So it was a really great acquisition. And today is a material producer of profit for the group. They operate in Australia, New Zealand, and in our bigger stores in South Africa, and we have 1 or 2 standalone stores. And then in my time as chairman, I made one of the great retail errors and bought David Jones. And it was an error that I passionately believed in. And when I look back and people say, oh, you made a terrible mistake, what do you think of that? Yes, it was for a time a mistake. Interesting, it's beginning to look as if there's some quite interesting green shoots coming out of David Jones. But we thought we could crack it. And it just was too big for us. It was too big an acquisition, and it's cost us time and shareholders' money. But it is a magical business. It in itself is 180 years old. So it's one of the oldest retail businesses in the world. So our Woolies, 90 years old, owns a 180-year-old David Jones. And as I say, it's beginning to look as if we might just get some nice benefit out of that business.
I see someone has posted Jack Wilton was Osna's husband, treated your dad in 48, and he was a surgeon during the War of Independence.
So they know my history. So Jack was my uncle, Osna was my father's sister, and Jack insisted that he operated on my father.
Simon, I cannot let you end the segment without you repeating the story that you told when you received the Jewish Achiever Award a few years back. And you told the story of how life is divided into certain segments. And I'd love you, if you don't mind, to repeat that, because it's a story I've repeated literally hundreds of times since you told it that evening.
So one of my hats that I wear until recently was president of the World Department Store Association. And in that, I became very close to a chap called B.S. Nagesh, who ran a great business in India called Shoppers Stop. And indeed, I now sit on a board in India, and when we were traveling, I still Zoom the board, and I see Nagesh often. He's a wonderful guy, great shopkeeper, great trader. And time came for Nagesh to step down as chief executive. And I said to him, Nagesh, what are you going to do with your life now? And he said, Simon, I was told by my guru. The guru said, you must spend the first third of your life learning. And then you can spend the second third of your life earning. He says, but you must spend the last third of your life returning. So that was Nagesh's mantra, and it's a pretty good mantra for all of us, I think.
Simon, thank you so much. If you can stay with us, that would be amazing. If you need to drop off, with absolute pleasure. But thank you for sharing those amazing family stories with us and the stories of Woolworths. I think truly an inspiration to so many people that are listening. Now, just before we come on to Gareth Ackerman and the story of the Ackermans, which is in itself is just such an amazing story, we've been running a patron campaign because for 100 webinars, we want you to join our family. We want you to help support the work that the South African Jewish Report does, the newspapers that read by about 55,000 people every week, the webinars that have been watched 800,000 times, the fact that we're delivering all to people's homes, apartment buildings, townhouse complexes, as well as retail stores. We would love you to be a donor or a patron of the South African Jewish Report. So Danny, very quickly, if you could just show us the patron video, please, and then we're going to ask people if they'd like to become a patron of the South African Jewish Report, just to click on the poll that we launch. So if you're willing to become a donor or patron of the South African Jewish Report, Danny is going to put a poll on the screen now. Please click yes. We'd love you to join us as a patron of the South African Jewish Report. And we're giving away incentives to people to become patrons of us. And what we've given away this evening are 5 900 Rand vouchers for Fila South Africa. You can get a hoodie, sweatshirt like the one that I'm wearing, or anything on the Fila South African website. And we asked in the beginning for the members of the board of the Jewish Report to just pick numbers, and I can tell you who our 5 winners tonight are. People who won a 900 Rand voucher each for Fila South Africa, and they are Irene Bacher, Melvin Boyskin, Joan Joffrey, Rendane Zebudladze, and Philippa Kotzen. So congratulations, Philippa Kotzen, Rendane Zebudladze, Joan Joffrey, Melvin Boyskin, and Irene Bacher. Thank you for being a patron and a supporter of the South African Jewish Report. Really, really appreciate it. And we will get you your vouchers this week, 900 Rand to spend on the Fila South African website. And we would love all of you to, in fact, become patrons or donors and help us in this journey of educating, informing, and entertaining our community. We're going to leave the poll up for another 20 seconds and then take it down. But Gareth, I want to tell you a story just before you tell me the story of your family. I was speaking to Joy Copland, whose father, Mr. Moraine, used to work for OK Bazaars. He worked for Mr. Cohen at OK Bazaars, and one of his jobs was to set up the first supermarket for OK Bazaars. And Mr. Cohen said, look, these are low margin items. You need to put them in the basement because the higher margin items we need to keep on the ground in the first floor when people go to. But there were problems because people had trolleys and they couldn't get them up the stairs of OK Bazaars. And then one day, Mr. Moraine saw that someone called Raymond Ackerman had bought 4 or 5 supermarkets. And Mr. Moraine called up Mr. Cohen and said, this man Ackerman is going to eat our lunch. We have to buy him out. And Mr. Cohen from OK Bazaar said, please, someone with 5 supermarkets, impossible, take no notice of the man. And I think today we know there is no longer an OK Bazaars, but there certainly is a Pick and Pay. So Gareth, please tell us about your family. How did all of this begin?
Oh, thank you, Howard. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here with you and your huge audience tonight. I'm not sure when last I spoke to an audience of over 1,000 people. It's
we have currently about 8,000 people watching us.
Wow. It's a lot more than I thought. So, well, thank you all, 8,000 of you from all over the world. And I've got a few WhatsApps from a couple of friends who are watching, and thank you for that as well. Yeah, it's great listening to Simon's story. And it's actually quite interesting how parallel the stories are. And I'm sure when we hear Michael's story, you'll hear the same thing as well. Because all our families all came from pretty much the same area. My family came from, well, one portion of my family, my father's grandfather came from Lithuania in about 1880. And I'm actually sitting in my office, and just above the wall up there, I've got a copy of his original naturalization certificates, where he was classed as an ostrich feather trader in the district of Riversdale, where he also owned a little hotel. But that's how they came to South Africa. In those days, ostrich feathers were very profitable, and that's how they earned a living. But so they arrived in South Africa. He had a family that he left behind in Plunyan, which is today Lithuania, and came out and married you see the pictures of this really young-looking girl. He had two kids. One was my grandfather, Gus, and he had a younger brother called Mick. And my grandfather, Gus, had to leave school quite early and to earn money for the two kids, because his father had died quite early and they were disinherited, and the earlier family sort of arrived and tried to take over their whatever they had left, apparently. So Gus started trading. His mother owned a tiny little store. For those of you who know Cape Town, we have a Plumstead Pick and Pay family store, one of our franchise stores. And on that site, 100 odd years ago, she'd have been my great-grandmother, owned a little trading store. And that's how they put my uncle Mick through university into medical. It then came to a stage, if you then look at my father's mother, my old Granny Ray, her parents came to South Africa from Ireland, from Dublin, where their family had been butchers for a couple of generations when they came from Lithuania in Dublin. And I think there still are distant family members in Dublin as butchers. He came out to South Africa. I don't think it was that successful, but anyway, he joined one of the early caravan trains into what is Rhodesia, and started a trading store up in Rhodesia, so it must have been 120 odd years ago. Eventually they came back to Cape Town, and he ended up working for my grandfather in Ackermans. If you then go to my mother's side of the family, and it's probably just as interesting, her grandfather came to South Africa and was a rabbi in Stellenbosch. And there wasn't that big a congregation in those days. So he earned his money on the side by running a little trading store in Stellenbosch. Apparently he didn't watch, he was too busy with his theology and didn't really watch the pennies too much. So it wasn't that successful. But anyway, my grandfather then became a dentist and spent all his life as a dentist, and eventually put a huge portion of his savings into Pick and Pay. And that's, in his latter years, was how he lived, was based on his earnings from Pick and Pay. But my grandmother my mother's mother was a really interesting one. Her father came to South Africa as a soldier in the Boer War. After the war, he was demobbed and stayed on the mines in Johannesburg and became a miner on the Jupiter mine. I gather he wasn't that reputable a character. Anyway, he didn't really look after his daughters very well. And my grandmother sort of earned the money to survive by playing as a pianist for the silent movies in Johannesburg. And then ended up working for one of the early bazaars. I think it was called M&L Bazaars, one of the predecessors to the OK in Johannesburg, where she ran the store. Anyway, they all got together, and my grandfather, Gus, started Ackermans with two partners just after the Second World War. And I think we were lucky to be here, because in 1917, he was about to be boarded on a ship to the First World War, and apparently him and a lot of mates got drunk and ended up in detention barracks, so never got the ship. And the rest of the platoon was wiped out in Delville Wood. So he stayed behind and ended up as a cook in the army for the rest of his career. But anyway, after the war, they started these little stores called Ackermans, which was a 1 in 11 store. And Philip sent me a note on the history today, and I just remembered it. The reason why it was called 1 in 11 was because they wanted the people to ring it up. It sounded cheaper, and at least if you ring it up, you could get the change and the people didn't pocket the money. It would come from Philip when he would find something like that. But that was the essence of where Pick n Pay came from. Then, not where Ackermans came from. He then ran it through the group ran it through the 30s, and during the Second World War, it started getting into cash flow problems because I think there was no goods, nothing was available. And just after the Second World War, he sold the business, or it was in the early 50s, he sold the business to Ackermans, where he became the vice chairman. And the reason it was called Ackermans because the Herber family, another Jewish family out of Joburg, wanted to be greater than Ackermans. So they called it Ackermans, and that's where the name Ackermans came from. But anyway, my father then joined the business as a trainee. I gather he was always quite touchy and difficult, even at the age of 90. Nothing's changed very much. But anyway, he knew exactly what he wanted. He knew the detail of retailing. He fell out with the controlling shareholders, and he'd started Checkers in late 50s. And 1966, my grandfather Gus died. And 3 weeks later, he was called in and basically fired by the Herbers. With 3.5 children, very little money, he moved to Cape Town and did what was probably today would be one of the first private equity deals in South Africa, where he got 50 shareholders, 25 from Joburg, 25 from Cape Town, put them together and bought these 4 small stores in Cape Town. So with 4 small stores, not a lot of money, a small equity stake. I don't know, today he did some financial gearing, which would not, I don't think, be allowed today, and ended up as a controlling shareholder of Pick n Pay by listing the company in 1968 on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And I think if you look at it, just as a little bit of an aside, at that time we were busy looking, and we found this little house in the coastal village near Cape Town. And he went to the guy who owned it and offered him 20,000 Pick n Pay shares on when the company listed. This guy had just been wiped out by the 1968 crash and decided not to take the shares and wanted the 20,000 Rand instead. So he got the 20,000 Rand. I'd hate to think with all the what have you, what that property would be worth today.
How much is your share price now?
You can't really look at it. The share price is about 55 Rand, but it's been split and all sorts of things many, many times. It's probably about 25 to 30 million Rand, if not more, if you look at the value. But it's, that's sort of where we came from. And today we're sitting with about 2,000 stores in 7 countries with about 90,000 employees. Both full-time, part-time, and in our corporate and in our franchise business. But if you look at the real key in the Pick n Pay business, and what really got us to where we are, is that there were probably 4 major tipping points in the Pick n Pay, which moved us from being just a small supermarket group to the group we are today. And if you think about Malcolm Gladwell's books, The Tipping Point, and you look at the timing when things happen, it was absolutely the time. And if you think about the major retailers in South Africa, and the 3 of us on the call today, all the businesses took advantage of that tipping point round about the end of the 60s in South Africa, when we were able to move from being small, relatively small businesses into the major businesses that we are today. So the first one was in round about 1969, 1970, when he had these 4 smalls in Cape Town, and my father then was being challenged by Checkers and OK. They came to Cape Town, decided to try and wipe him out. So he jumped into Port Elizabeth, opened a store in Port Elizabeth, and very quickly thereafter opened a store in Johannesburg. It was opening another front, and that effectively is what saved and helped the business growing. helped the business to grow. The second major tipping point was when he started in 1975, the first hypermarkets in South Africa. And that really was what put Pick n Pay properly on the map in South Africa, because it was a fundamental shift and a fundamentally different way of retailing in South Africa. And it was one of the big trends that was happening in the world. And that really established Pick n Pay as a major chain as we rolled out these hypers across the country. The third major tipping point was in the early 1990s when we launched franchising, which effectively doubled the size of the business. And it really made Pick n Pay a much bigger brand, a much bigger stretch across the country, and enabled us to get to markets and to elicit people into the business who hadn't been able to get part of the Pick n Pay brand up until then. And the final, I think, tipping point, which is the one that we really are working strongly on today, was when we first moved into the purchase of Score and latterly into the purchase of Boxer, and to really move Pick n Pay from being in the top end of the market into being very much a mass market business. And today it's one of the major profit drivers. And those two, be it franchising and Score and Boxer today, are some of the major profit drivers within the business. But if you look at the whole Pick n Pay concept, it was really built around three core values. The three values are, and unfortunately Simon already mentioned them all, but the three core values are, firstly, the customer is queen. Do what is right for the customer, and the customer will do what is right for you. And it's a much broader definition of just making sure the service is good. It's about range, it's about products, it's about marketing, it's about stores, it's about all those issues. But look after the customer and they'll look after you. The second one is to be the most efficient business that you possibly can, because if you're really efficient as a business, you can get your prices low and you can be more competitive and therefore look after your customers better. And then if you look at it becomes a very virtuous circle. And the third core value that we have is doing good as good business. Now, that doing good as good business is absolutely something around which we've built the business over the last, 50 odd years, and continue to do so at the moment. I was really proud a couple of weeks ago when we had these huge fires in Cape Town, and without even asking our team, they got into gear and were in full flight and helping the people and helping with the fires that happened in Cape Town. At the same time, there was a fire at the Charlotte Mackenzie Hospital in Johannesburg, and our teams were in there helping them as well. We don't even have to ask our people to do it. They just do it today because that is part of the culture of the business in which we operate. But about 10 years ago, I became the chairman of Pick n Pay. I'd been right through the business. I started when I was about 10 years old, going on a Friday night with my father around stores. I did everything. I packed the butter. I packed at the checkouts. I was a cashier right the way through my school. I remember at the age of about 15 or 16, I was working in the Plumstead store. It was in a corporate store. And the fruit and veg manager walked out. So the manager turned around to me and said, well, I'm sorry, you're now in charge. You're the manager. So at the age of 16, having worked 5 days in the store, I was the produce manager. So I turned around and said, how can you do that? You've got a guy as a supervisor who's been working here for 10 years. Surely he should be running it. And he said, no, can't do it. You're going to run it. So I sat down with this guy. We worked together and we ran the store. I was gone in 3 weeks. I had to go back to school. But it was the most amazing experience. And those type of things happened with my career right the way through Pick n Pay. And I was always thrown in at the deep end. So after I finished university, my father decided, well, I decided with my father that I was going to go and do an internship in the States. I was there for I went for 3 months. I came back 2 years later. And the reason he chose the company I went to work for was that it was the largest bankruptcy that had ever happened in the States at that time. And he wanted me to go and see how not to run a business. So I went into this company and I was reprimanded on the first day, and this was in South Florida, for not wearing a three-piece suit to the office. Now, if you're going to run a supermarket in a three-piece suit, you are going to be in trouble. I then was I was running what was called store systems. I was working in the store systems department, installing scanning and labor scheduling. And the stuff we were doing in the early 80s, we haven't, I don't think, even got to in Pick and Pay yet in terms of the level of sophistication that we could get to then. And I won't go into the reasons why, but anyway, so I was going around all these stores, and eventually one day I walked into the president's office, and I said to him, the reason why these particular stores are not doing well, I can show you. Please come with me. And it took me about 10 minutes to persuade him to get in his car and go with me down to this one store. So we walked into the store, and as you walked into the store, you see this huge, big display of, it was Jewish New Year products on display in the store. And he looked around, it was well merchandised, well signed. So he says, well, what's wrong? So I said, well, you haven't looked at the demographics. In 1970, this store was the heart of the Jewish community. In 1980, this store was 50% Black and 50% Hispanic, and there were no Jewish community anywhere around it. So he said, oh, well, what should we do? So I said, well, very simply, in my view, is have a regional manager that comes from the community, change the marketing, change the merchandise, and the store will do fine. He said, yeah, you're brilliant. He changed it. Within 3 weeks, the store tripled its turnover, and he offered me a job as the vice president of something or the other, I can't remember. So I decided at that stage that this company really wasn't going very far. And Pick and Pay made me a huge offer at that stage to come back and to go and help open the Australian operation. So I came back to South Africa, got married, and went straight the next day to Australia, where we lived for a couple of years. Unfortunately, that didn't work because it was in the mid-80s, and P.W. Burt was wagging his finger at the Rubicon, and the Australian unions put a black ban on our second store. So we were one of the few people in 1986 who actually came back to South Africa when everybody else was leaving. And we've been living here ever since. I then went through the business, became the joint managing director, ran our group enterprise division for a number of years. And then I decided that I wanted to go non-executive. So I went off, started my own little private equity consulting business and ran that and did a lot of lecturing at university for about 10 years until my father decided to retire and I took over as chairman. And since then, we've had 3 CEOs, 2 of which have been professional CEOs we brought outside. The most recent one, Peter Bruno, who we just started with us a couple of weeks ago. But it has been a real journey. And I had tea with my parents this morning, and my father, all he wants to know is exactly what's happening in the business, meticulous detail, not about how the grandchildren or how the great-grandchildren are. It's all about his first love, which is the Pick and Pay business. And it's actually wonderful to be able to go and spend time with him and actually talk these things through. And even today, we still get some really good advice from him because he comes to the board meetings, he comes to, and he actually gives management quite a hard time when he comes in, because if they're not following his basic principles, particularly of the consumerism and looking after the communities. But I'll finish it off with a same plastic bag story as what happened to Simon. So I was shopping one day in our Constantia store last year, the year before last, just before lockdown. And I'd come out, I'd forgotten to bring my plastic bags with me. So I bought some bags from the cashier. And as I was packing my groceries, a customer comes up to me and said, "How dare you buy bags? You're telling all of us not to buy the bags, and here you are buying them. You should be carrying your own bags back to the store." Like Simon, I was suitably chastened, and now I'm very careful to keep bags in the boot of my car for when I have to go shopping. But thank you very much. That's just an overview of my story. I'm very happy as well to take questions.
So, Gareth, can you tell us a story about 2 things? Because Pick and Pay tried to break the price monopoly on cigarettes and on petrol. Can you tell us what happened with both of those?
I can tell you, one of which we were fairly successful at, the other one we were totally unsuccessful at. On the cigarettes, look, I was young and I just remember it, but my father tried to cut the price of cigarettes in the retail stores. At that stage, there was a monopoly. It was Rembrandt and the different companies in those days, and they cut Pick and Pay off totally from cigarettes because we were trying to cut the price. So what he did was he actually went to a wholesalers. He dressed his guys up in one of the competitors' uniforms, went into wholesale, bought cigarettes, and took them across to Pick and Pay and was selling them in the stores. And they never knew how he got the cigarettes. The upside of that story was that for I don't know how many years, he fought the different cartels, he fought the government on resale price maintenance. And basically, in 1994, when the new government came in, all price controls were gone on every single product in South Africa, except for petrol. And petrol still remains today as a price control product. We fought something like 25 cases against the government on petrol. Today, I think we've got one, but we were trying to sell it the other day. Petrol station left. We rather decided to focus our effort on having convenience stores with BP, our Pick and Pay Express stores with BP, which is how we deal with it today. But we have got the one up on all of this, because with our Smart Shopper card and with our banking card that we've got, we can actually give discounts on petrol today, which we could never do in the past. So, but it's what the previous government never realized was that they were the most effective marketing tool that my father could possibly find. He always went against the resale price maintenance, and the consumer loved it. They threatened to lock him up once for cutting the price of bread, and he said he'd love to go to jail for cutting the price of bread because he's trying to help the poor people in the country. He had numerous fights with P.W. Botha and Forster around the shenanigans he got up to with cutting the price. But that's really how Pick and Pay was built, on the marketing around looking after the consumer. And it was never for him a marketing ploy. This was him, he sort of fundamentally believed was the right thing to do, and still does.
I see there's a question from Gerald Romanowski. He says, did Raymond not buy his first store from Golden? And I think Golden was the original founder of Clicks, if I'm not mistaken, in Rondebosch, and build from there.
He bought 4 stores from Jack Golden, one of which was at the bottom of Rondebosch. There was one in Bergvliet, there was one in Lansdowne Road in Claremont, and there was one in Solari Road. And yeah, she bought them from Jack Golden, and then Jack went on to found Clicks a couple of years later.
So someone's WhatsApped me a question, and they say, when you and Simon see each other walking down the promenade in Cape Town, do you get along with each other, or are you fierce competitors and just look the other way and continue walking?
Well, I don't walk down the promenade very often because I don't live on that side of the mountain. But when I do see Simon, we do get on very well. There's no reason for that. And okay, we get on with all our competitors. We fight in the marketplace, and we always have. I chair the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, and I used to chair the International Consumer Goods Forum. And all the retailers were there, and all the South African retailers were there. And in South Africa, the South African retailers all sit on the board. We all sit on the board together. We always make sure we've got a lawyer with us when we talk, so we're not accused of colluding, because we've spent about 10 years fighting with the Competitions Commission, who keep accusing us of some form of collusion or the other. But we all get on well. We don't see each other a lot or socially very much, but there's no negative, I don't think. You have to ask Simon that question.
Simon, do you avoid Gareth when you see him, should he ever come to the promenade side?
Number one, he lives on the wrong side of the mountain. Number two, he's a wonderful guy and we get on very well, and we don't see each other that often. And number three, I have to say, the point that Gareth made about us getting on and yet competing fiercely is really, really true. And as a young man in business in South Africa, many occasions overseas at conferences, Gareth's father would see me at a conference and say, come, Simon, you come and sit at our table, you join us, I'll introduce you to people. He was unbelievable like that. And then we would go home and compete as fiercely as we could. So I think this mutual respect and in a real way, admiration has been fantastic for all of us. And yes, I think Gareth's a great guy. So there we go.
And also, we don't shop in the same stores. That's the other point.
We don't shop together. It's wonderful.
Well, you should certainly see each other at Michael Lewis's store and Philip Krawitz's store for sure. Michael, we're going to come to you in 2 minutes' time, but one of our sponsors this evening is, in fact, Mantis Security, who I'm sure look after a lot of the shopping centers and shopping malls that all of you have your stores in. So let's see a very quick video from Mantis, and we're going to come back and speak to Michael Lewis about the amazing Foschini group of companies. So a big thank you to Mantis for supporting us this evening. Michael Lewis, you join us from New York this evening. We speak about the Foschini Group, but of course the Foschini Group is what, 42 different brands across 37 odd countries. What is this Foschini Group thing?
Well, firstly, thank you. Forgive me, everybody. I've got a slightly bad throat, so apologies if I croak a bit. Firstly, Howard, thanks very much for convening this to the Jewish Report, to my very distinguished panelists, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful, and it's a pleasure to be here. Before I tell you or answer your question as to what comprises the Foschini Group, I want to, excuse me, just pick up on something that Gareth said, which is so profound, and actually Simon touched on it as well, which is the commonality of our stories. And some of the anecdotes that have already been mentioned resonate with me directly. So, Simon, you'll be interested to know that I did a sort of a thesis, I guess, at university on entrepreneurship. And one of the people I went to see was your father, and I spent hours with him, and he was incredibly generous to me with his time. And we spoke very broadly, including, he didn't actually mention the Mossad, but he certainly mentioned the War of Independence, and he indicated something broader than that. I knew he was injured. I knew somebody actually with whom he was injured, who was in his platoon. And you used the word plagiarist in a lovely way. And he said to me, Michael, you shouldn't be interviewing me. All we are is sensitive plagiarists, meaning that he sort of copied this idea from Marks and Spencer, characteristically humble of him, but it was a lovely little story. And then the other one that I think people may be interested in is, I'll tell the story of my grandfather in a moment, but Simon, your dad bought my grandfather's home, and I guess you grew up in it.
We grew up in Cornwall.
That's right. And so much of the family history, especially the difficult times that I'll refer to in a moment, took place at Cornwall. And then Gareth, we go back a long, long way. And you very interestingly referred to the 50 shareholders that your dad put together to found Pick n Pay, or to buy it, I guess, from Jack. My father was best friends at school, head boy, joint head boy, Victor Ladorum, rugby, cricket, the whole thing, with Raymond's brother-in-law, who was married to Moira Fine, who was Raymond's sister, obviously. And Izzy approached my dad, and my dad was actually one of the original investors in Pick n Pay. I'm sure we didn't keep the shares long enough. Probably, I'm sure we should have, but it was just, it's just, I guess, emblematic of the point you were making about how these stories are intertwined. And Gareth, I often think how very similar our stories are, and it's a good segue into the history, in the sense that we both our grandparents founded businesses that bore their name. Both of them were forced in one way or another to leave those businesses, I'll talk about in a moment, and both of them went on to found their own businesses and develop those and make the mark that they made. So Howard, if I may, if you don't mind, I'll just do a little history, and then by all means, we'll Q&A and try and answer those questions and the questions more broadly that are in the 8,000 people that are listening, and thank you. So the story is very similar to many of the Jewish stories. My grandfather, on my father's side, paternal grandfather, Meyer Lewis, came from Latvia, Ventspils, and 1908 escaped in the hay cart, went to England for 6 months, hated it there, got on the Union Castle line, came to South Africa. It's a very typical story. On my mother's side, they were Lithuanian. Interestingly, and this, Simon, was a big part of the discussion I had with your father. On my mother's side, very revisionist, a very right-wing revisionist. My mother's name is Zia Theodora. She was named after Zev Jabotinsky and Theodor Herzl. And her brother, my uncle, was Max Nordau. So these were all very, very strong revisionist type of names at the, obviously in the founding of Zionism in the state. But my grandfather came and landed. The story is actually that he was on his way to, or they were all on their way to Peru. But somehow somebody pulled him off the ship in Cape Town. Somebody who he knew from, or knew that he was coming in some way, somebody called Immerman, took him off the ship and he stayed. Very broadly became a smos, sold many of the things, Simon, you said your grandfather sold, knitting needles and buttons and cotton, and attempted to develop, to make a living, and did until I guess that it was the depression that really took him down, and he was really bankrupt essentially after the the 29 crash 1930. But what he did manage to do was learn something about furniture, because when some of these customers couldn't pay cash for what he was selling them, he took bits of furniture instead, so in exchange, so lamps, bedside tables, things of that nature. He learned about wood and he learned about furniture. And in 1936, I'll come back to the more to the personal side in a bit, because it's an interesting story and relevant to how Foschini got established. But he bought Woodstock Auction Mart with £25 that he borrowed from different people. And Woodstock Auction Mart was a second-hand reseller of it was an auction mart really for second-hand furniture on the site of the Lewis stores in Woodstock today, which the store is still there actually. It was a store until about a year ago, and they turned it into a call center. But it's there on the right-hand side. You can see the big Lewis sign in Woodstock. It's a sort of a landmark Jewish history of Woodstock. It's all there. So and then after the auction mart, he decided that he knew enough about furniture to establish a furniture retail store and set up what was called M. Lewis and Company, which later became Lewis Stores. I'll just go back a moment and tell you about his personal history. So he was a bachelor, obviously, and he also was penniless and couldn't speak the language. And he during his travels in the Northern Cape in Kennard, he met my grandmother, who had been recently widowed with 3 children. And they fell in love, and he married her. So he had 3 stepchildren effectively, and then had my father and his sister. So there were 2 full and 3 halves. Gareth, that's a little bit like your story too, from memory, your dad's story. And then, but they all became Lewis, and they were all together and all worked very, very closely in the founding of Lewis Stores. The older 2 brothers, Jack and Izzy, worked with my dad was the youngest, worked with my grandfather to establish Lewis Stores. My grandfather was the trader, very raw, entrepreneurial in that immigrant way. And Jack particularly was the very disciplined, very well organized, very smart, intellectual, thoughtful person. My dad always told the story of when they built that building in Woodstock. He remembers Jack going to measure the distance between the bricks in the face brick to make sure that it was properly done. So Jack played a huge role in the business. So did Izzy. My dad was the youngest. In the 40s, Lewis Stores was going to go public actually and expand its footprint very dramatically, and references being made to the Cohens of OK Bazaars. The deal that was done was that the Lewis Stores was going to put concessions in every OK Bazaar store in South Africa. You can imagine what that would have done to Lewis Stores, which by then had 3 or 4 stores. My father was sent overseas in 1946 to buy product in anticipation of this major deal. And on the back of it, the company was going to go public and raise capital. So what happened was that when my dad got back and the commitments had been made to product, the Cohens scuppered the deal, actually. What really happened was that they couldn't agree a rental for the concessions. And so the deal fell apart. And that left Lewis Stores very stretched financially and the family in pretty difficult circumstances. So there was an intermediary, a fellow called Simi Bloomberg, who was the brother of Izzy Bloomberg, who was the Adele Searle's father, who had connections with Isaac Wolfson in the United Kingdom. So Isaac Wolfson later became Great Universal Stores. And he managed to get Isaac and GUS to come in to Lewis Stores to stabilize their financial situation, overstretched situation. And then they actually did take it public. So in the 40s, although our family still controlled Lewis Stores, mid to late 40s, GUS came in and was a major shareholder alongside the public with our family. What then happened was an incredible story of great tragedy and really the galvanizing of my father from the kid brother to what he became. So in April of 1950, my father's brother Jack was killed in his own aeroplane. My dad and he flew together, and they loved it. My dad always loved flying, and Jack was, the older brother, and they used to fly together. And Jack was killed very tragically on the 17th of April, 1950. 6 weeks later, Izzy, the second brother, dropped dead of a heart attack. My dad was on his way to, and my grandfather was on his way to pick him up for Kaddish at Claremont Shore, and he put one sock on, keeled over, and that was that. So my dad went from the youngest to the oldest in 6 weeks. The mark that it made on the entire family was very obvious. I mean, it doesn't need much statement. Simon, my father remembers my grandfather when they found his body, Jack Lewis's body, running across the garden at Cornwall, saying to his wife, they found him because they were hoping that he was alive, but sadly he wasn't. The Great Universal Stores, there was a deal with them where they had to approve what was paid to the family executive, people running the business, my dad and others. And in their wisdom, and they decided that the widows who each had 2 small children should get 1 month of salary, and that's it, the month in which they died. And there was also a suit to try and get his life insurance paid. Cecil Margot, acting for the insurance company, managed to persuade the court that my uncle had been negligent and therefore should not get the insurance payout. That may have been true. But when my dad asked Isaac Wilson to provide a character reference for my uncle, the meticulous person that he was, they refused to do it, didn't want to be drawn into the battle. Those events left my father, very uncomfortable he was at that stage joint managing director of Lewis Stores was somebody that they had sent out from England, and that GUS had sent out from England. The family there was no estate planning. There were these widows to take, excuse me, to take care of, and the family was forced to sell some of its Lewis Stores shares, and GUS took control of Lewis Stores at that point. And my dad determined right then and there that it would be a matter of time, not if, but when, he would leave and to try and found a company or establish a business that represented the values that he found that were relevant to him, which he did. It took 7 years till 1957, where he was offered a 25% stake in Foschini Limited at the time, which had, I think, 70 dress shops, small dress shops. It looked to my dad on due diligence, a kind of break-even business. It was founded by an American, was listed on the stock exchange from like the early 30s. It was founded by an American called George Rosenthal, and the idea was to bring in Northern Hemisphere fashions and sell them in the Southern Hemisphere. And just about the time my dad bought, the anti-dumping regulations prohibited that mode of trade. They were introduced and prohibited that mode of trade. And literally the year he got in, instead of a business that was broadly break square, it was a significant loss, which was a huge shock to him and really galvanized him to begin turning the business around, which he did. And the rest of the story is history. And I'm happy to talk more about what is now the Foschini Group, or TFG, because the Foschini business, the women's business, is a very small part of the total. But I thought I'd stop there to tell you, to just see if there are questions or how in any direction you'd like to shape the conversation. But it's a very powerful story of a Jewish story that we all have in common, and that led to this man my dad determining that he was not going to make he was not, even if he had to earn less money and be less secure. And my mother agreed with him on that he was never going to work for a company whose values he didn't appreciate and represented, his values. And he said,
so
I'm going to found a company that represents those values and plant the roots so deep that it'll survive me and will be some credit to the society. And I hope that is what TFG is.
So today, tell us what TFG looks like.
TFG is essentially four, I guess, different businesses. One is a sports business, so that's Total Sports and Sports Scene. That's the biggest single part of the business. It's a men's business, the Markham Group, and a very successful men's group in Australia called Retail Apparel Group. So men's, actually, when you look at it all together, is the biggest part of the business. Sport is second. Then you've got jewelry and homewares, and you've got women's wear as well. Most recently, during the crisis last year, we bought Jet out of the Edgar's insolvency. So it is very, though, substantially driven by sport and men's, now with a big discount piece to it. Gareth referred to the transformation of Pick n Pay in that direction. We see that as a very important piece of the TFG story as it unfolds. And it also has a business in the UK, 3 niche brands in women's wear, badly affected by the lockdowns. 50% of the days were lost in trading, but it'll come right. So it's got, I think, 3,000 points of sale around the world. It is in 37 countries. That sounds a bit better than it actually is. The 80-20 principle, it's probably 70% of its stores are in Southern Africa. The vast bulk of the rest of it is certainly in terms of profit and turnover are in Australia. And that's pretty much what comprises it today. About 35 billion of sales and a 50-odd billion rounded market cap.
And staff-wise, how many across the group?
35,000, I believe, is the figure.
So when you think back at your family history, was there one moment that turned it from a small group of women's clothing shops What was it that turned it into the powerhouse that it is today?
Well, it was destined to be that way because of my dad's determination to create something that was durable and that represented his values. There was nothing. My sisters and my mother and all of our broader family will remember that the single-minded determination of this man at every turn to create a business like that. He was absolutely determined. In 68, he bought this 25% in 57, and between 57 and about 65, he bought another 25% in the stock market, and so he owned 50% of it, and then floated Lefik, which is the Louis Foschini investment company, in 68. Gareth referred to it. A lot of people were doing that at that time, formed this pyramid holding company, and he and at the same time bought Markham's, as it was called then, and American Swiss. So the diversification out of women's began very early in his mind into men's and into jewelry. And then I would say, then there was this whole question of store size. So it was largely a rural business in small towns. During Sharpeville, when rentals collapsed, he expanded into small towns, very favorable rentals. It was the re-engineering of the business, logistics, planning, technology, that enabled him to be confident, he and his team, to be confident enough to build bigger stores and come into the cities. That was a real game changer. Again, Gareth, probably in the mid-70s when your dad was doing the hypermarkets. I think that was the really very important moment. And from then on, continual additional segments of the market that the business felt capable of attacking. Sport was obviously a very big one for us. That was the acquisition of Total Sport. And then the building of Sports Scene out of that. I think we bought 2 or 3 stores and built Sports Scene out of that, and then the international diversification. So it's really a brick on brick story. There's no sort of giant moment, but I would say the mid-70s, where the business was opening 100 stores in a year on a relatively small base. The 70s were a very big area, a period of growth, and the 80s. But I would say it transformed from a very small business into a reasonable sized business until, during the mid-70s, probably mid-70 to mid-80s. And then from then on, the growth continued, obviously.
Shirley Efron keeps on messaging us to say, who was your grandmother from Kennard? Because she's in San Diego at the moment, but she comes from that area of the Northern Cape. She'd love to know who your grandmother is.
Her maiden name was Hessen. Her name was Fanny. Her maiden name was Hessen. And her sister, Rosie Hessen, was married to somebody called Abram Bernberg, and they had a hotel in Kennard, the hotel in Kennard. That's where my grandfather used to stay. And I looked at their marriage certificate, interestingly. His address was Kennard, and my grandmother's was Muizenberg for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, because they moved to Muizenberg many years later after they sold Quernmore and the family tragedies that I described. And he was also described, Simon, you mentioned your grandfather as well. He was described on his birth certificate, on the marriage certificate, as a speculator.
So, Michael, we're going to move to Philip Krawitz in a moment, but there's one question that keeps on coming up, and that's the issue of culture. And to be able to stamp your culture and that level of entrepreneurship is really difficult when you're acquiring businesses. How have you tried to make sure that the culture of the business is maintained?
There was a quote, I actually wrote it down just to remind myself of it. My dad, they produced a brochure in the 80s, early 80s, and he wrote actually extensively about the role of technology, but that's not the one I'm going to quote. He said, a business succeeds not because it is large or long founded, but because there are people in it who eat, sleep, and drink it and build great future plans for it. It's all about people. In the retail business, anybody can tell you whatever they like. I'm sure these panelists would absolutely agree. If you have to have dedicated professionals who are determined to deliver for the customer and do everything from there backwards to deliver on that promise. That includes obviously the level of integrity, the level of investment in the business. And one of the things we're incredibly proud of is the manufacturing. We have, Simon, you spoke about the role that Woolworths played in the clothing industry in South Africa in the early days. TFG has made a very concerted commitment to actually owning factories, something we never did, but to owning factories and owning the supply chain, trying to get as much control over the supply chain as we can. And in so doing, revitalize the clothing industry around South Africa and certainly in the Western Cape. So it's my dad planted very deep values of integrity and commitment, hard work, transparency, that people will tell you. He's been gone for a long time, my dad, but that people will tell you, I walk around that building and in the stores all the time, and people come up to me and they say they either remember him or they remember something about him, a story about him. He embodied those values because he was determined, post being treated the way he was in GUS, in much the same way, Gareth, I guess your dad was treated by the Herbers and in Greatermans, to build something that represented those values. And no executive, I mean, of course there are things that go wrong, but no executive within the Foschini group can survive without embodying those values. We've had, since he was chief executive, we've had 5 chief executives, each one of them, in different ways, of course, have embodied those values. Elliot Osran took over as chairman from my dad in 2000, and David Nurek after him, and I after David. And a lot of what we do is in people planning, succession planning, and ensuring that the right kind of person it permeates the business from top to bottom.
You know, we're going to come back with this issue of succession after we've heard from Philip, because so many people keep on asking the question, what about your kids? Are we going to see your kids in the business in the next generation? So I don't want anyone to answer that now, but I think it's an important question that we do come back. Philip, just before we come to you, one of our sponsors tonight is Hold Real Estate in Israel. And they're really responsible for making sure that if you're looking to buy a property in Israel, whether it's because you're making Aliyah or alternatively because you're looking for a holiday home or a second home in Israel, they will take you right through the entire process from start to finish, from opening bank accounts to doing insurance to doing construction. So let us watch a very quick video from Hold, who've also said if you want to be on their mailing list, there's a way to get onto their mailing list as well. So Danny, show us quickly the whole ad, please.
Where is home? Is it the place where we're born? Is it where we see ourselves retiring? For Jews around the world, Israel, the Holy Land, will always be the place we belong. Let us find your perfect home. Because we realize that purchasing property is just the beginning of the journey, and everything that comes afterwards can be a little overwhelming. Our team will hold your hand throughout the process. Legal services, opening bank accounts, organizing mortgages, project management, and post-sales management of the property, including finding tenants and managing your apartment. You can trust that with over 20 years experience and backed by the biggest development companies in Israel, our team is focused exclusively on representing the unique needs of our buyers. Anything is possible, and we will make your dream a reality. Talk to us about finding and securing your future property in Israel.
So if you would like any more information about Hold Real Estate, Danny's going to put up a poll right now and you can get onto their mailing list or get someone to give you a shout. So please feel free to answer that question that you'll see on your screen right now. And as we do that, Philip Krawitz, you are the father of Cape Town Jewelry. You are everyone's favorite person coming out of the Western Cape. And your story is not dissimilar to the sort of story that we've heard. You are third generation in the business as well, are you not?
Indeed. Thanks, Howie. Yes. Firstly, I just want to say that it's really an honor to be in such an esteemed company. We literally feel like the tadpole in the bullfrog pond. You know, Gareth speaks of 2,000 stores. We have around 300. He employs 60,000 people. We employ about 3,600. So certainly we are the minnows. But we are very much a family business, still 100% owned by the family and run very much in that way. In fact, our mission says we want to be a world-class retailer, trusted for our family values and our passion to improve lives. So that's really what we want to do, and that's how we try and move forward. I must also say that I had the great privilege and pleasure of knowing all three of the fathers. Certainly, I have such fond memories of David Susman, who always had time to walk past our tiny little shop on the corner of Corporation and Master Street, would pop in, would come for a chat. Absolutely humble people who never sort of lauded their greatness over you. The countless hours I had the privilege of spending with Raymond and learning so much from him, always courtesy. And of course, the late great Stanley, who was also one of the most courteous people you could imagine. And I think that one of the things you have to learn from that is that the traits of humility and sincerity are probably the greatest assets which anyone can leave behind, because those are the memories which people will remember you by. Our story is not dissimilar to the others. The late great my grandfather, Philip Krawitz, leaves Salant in 1886, hears about gold in South Africa, comes out here, poor Russian immigrant as he's described, doesn't speak a word of English, no money at all, and does the usual thing, puts a pack on his back and goes out trying to sell and deal as he can. The next time he goes around, it's not with a pack, it's with a Cape cart and horse. And then shortly thereafter, he forms a little business called P. Krawitz and Company, which is the forerunner of Cape Union Mart. He unfortunately takes ill, comes down to Cape Town, decides P. Krawitz is a little bit too ethnic, and decides to open up the Mart. Well, he couldn't get registration from the Mart. They said, that's a generic word. So he said, okay, call it the Cape Mart. He said, no, that's also still generic. He said, well, it's the Union of South Africa, it's Cape Town, let's call it the Cape Union Mart. And hence the name, the Cape Union Mart, was born. And I have to pay huge tribute to my late father and mother, who were the most exceptional people. We came to Cape Town, they had nothing. We stayed at the Winchester Mansions, the residential hotel in those days, one room. That's where I spent the first 2 years of my life. And my parents were trying desperately to do something to build up a business. My grandfather had taken ill. The war years had absolutely wrecked the business. It was totally bankrupt. And my dad went round to his creditors and said, look, let me work, give me some credit, give me some stock, and I will try and pay you back every cent that I owe you. And with the exception of one creditor, they all said, your father was an honest man, we'll give you that chance. And the one exception was a company that my dad never ever bought from until his dying day, and thereafter the company imploded. So that was my dad. And then of course there was my incredible mother, who worked in the shop every day of her life. She was known as Miss Swiss Army Knife salesperson, who was there selling everybody a Swiss Army knife who came up to the cash till. And she was working her butt off there. My dad would travel the world for his customers. He'd never been overseas. And he decided to make this a really friendly place for people to come. Well, what happened I believe on my birthday in 1950, something remarkable happened. While my mother was in labor giving birth to me, the Russian fishermen and the Russian fleet arrived. And my dad was, of course, selling Norwegian jerseys and Norwegian socks and sou'westers and all these things to the Russians. And then came the Dutch whalers with the Willem Barents ship, etc. And my dad was selling to all of these people as well. But we had a little problem. On the one side of us was Woolworths, and on the other side of us was OK Bazaars. And just like Simon says, my dad also said, he said, perhaps the only way we can make money is if we change the name of our building of our store to Main Entrance. Well, he didn't do that, but he realized that you had to pull people up Plain Street, you had to pull them past the shops in Adderley Street, and there had to be a reason to come to Cape Union Mart. And never mind all the professors of the day, I believe that my dad cottoned onto it pretty early, when as far as he was concerned, he had to develop a USP, a unique selling proposition. And so he decided that we had to get goods that nobody else had. He was the first person to import Levi jeans into this country. One of the seamen had a thing called an anorak, which was actually an Eskimo word. My dad fancied it so much he had it copied and decided that we'd import it. In those days, a big order for us was 2 dozen. And he grew this little business by having different merchandise. He would carry winter goods in summer and summer goods in winter for the travel market. Still today, a huge part of our business. He would carry bigger sizes than anybody because you couldn't get big sizes anywhere. And literally from an anchor to a toothpick, that's how he built the business. Well, like Simon, and like Gareth, I too spent most of my Friday afternoons and Saturday mornings working in the store. Of course, I wasn't allowed onto the shop floor initially. I worked in the stock room. I was then allowed to watch for thieves. I was then allowed to pack parcels. But it was wonderful training and I enjoyed it. And it was greatly, greatly enriching. And at that stage, as I say, we had my mom and dad, an aunt was in the business. We had a cousin of mine who then joined the business, John Ratzker, as who became our financial director. And the business grew and did quite well. Along came an opportunity to buy a wholesaler of ours called Sparks and Others, who were in the uniform game. And we did that. And we did that at a rather good time because South Africa was calling up all the conscriptees. And we were there to give them all the little luxuries that they needed for their army training. And then, of course, the government came out with the problems on the petrol story. The petrol price had soared. Everybody was into motorbikes. So we went into motorcycle clothing, and that grew and grew as well. Well, this little uniform business that we bought, we had 3 or 4 tailors who used to make uniforms for us. And my dad used to love chatting to all the traffic officers and tormenting them. He would keep his 5-cent piece and walk around anonymously and see if somebody's meter was about to expire and pop the money in the meter. But somehow he got chatting to them all, and he came and we showed them our uniforms, and we won an order for the city of Cape Town. Now you try with 4 tailors and make uniforms for a couple of hundred people, but we managed. And shortly thereafterwards, we preceded Foschini Group. We bought a little factory. The factory that we bought was actually the Hepworths factory, which had come out to South Africa at the turn of the century. And we started making uniforms. And then that grew. And we said, well, why don't we make a bit of protective clothing there? Now, here's another little anecdote, which is rather cute. My dad was always known as Mr. K in the business. And he would call together the 2 or 3 salespeople who we had. He would call me in. He would have the agent ready who had the shoes. And he said, okay, I want your opinion as to which one we should buy. So we would all agree, we'd say, we think number 1, number 3, and number 5. My dad would say, yes, now I've listened to you all very carefully, but we're going to buy number 2, number 4, number 7. And we would always turn around and say, yeah, as usual, he'll do it the K way. And so the name K way was born. And certainly in the outdoor field, K way today is by far and away the number 1 brand in the outdoor market in South Africa. They referred to people looking for the South African Airways planes overseas as just looking for the K-way cues. And really it's become quite a colloquialism that people buy a K-way today. Well, I also have 3 daughters and really blessed with 3 amazing daughters. One of them who now lives in Israel, studied fashion at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and came to me and said, Dad, why do we have nothing for women? Well, we had a very creative guy who'd been a design director for Burberry's in the UK by the name of Ken Lazarus. And Ken loved challenges and said, fine, well, we'll create it. And so poetry was born. And before that, Old Khaki was born, going for the younger market. And then we grew a little bit further and we bought Kido, the clothing brand, because I gave a talk and the lady who owned Kido said, you know what, we share the same values. So can I sell my company to you? And we bought it. And we then started a footwear chain called Tread and Miller. Well, let me tell you, we couldn't have got our timing worse because as I'm probably sitting here tonight and many of the others as well, I'm chatting to you, but there are no shoes on my feet. And who's buying occasion footwear when there's no occasions to wear occasion footwear? And who's buying occasion wear clothing for poetry when nobody's here? So we've had a tough time and lots of challenges, but fortunately, my late dad always taught me that cash was king, and we have managed to survive, and we still managed to have a little bit of cash in the bank. And so we are surviving to this day. Now, how do we compete against my esteemed colleagues who I really respect and admire in every way? I go back to my dad. What can we do that's different? So we have 4 swords of Damocles which hang over every buyer. And before they go ahead and sign off on a new product or anything that they're buying, they have to ask themselves 4 questions. Number 1, does the product represent excellent value for money? Number 2, will the durability exceed the customer's expectation? Very important, and it'll last and be good. Number 3, will it meet the purpose for which it was designed? In other words, will the photographer's vest really accommodate the lens that wide? And number 4, will it have an added value feature which will be of benefit to the customer? So our poor buyers have to check those 4 things off every day, and they work hard at it and diligently. We've also learned one thing. This is a people's business. This is all about people. And so our philosophy is very simple. If we can attract, train, care for, retain, and inspire better people than the opposition, we win. And we really try hard at that and try and look after our staff. And what wasn't mentioned tonight, another point of commonality, is the huge contribution of Jewish businesses and Jewish retailers in this country to the upliftment of staff and the fair treatment of people. And that's, I believe the Jewish community have been example setters, and we should be very, very proud of that. Now, as far as the future going forward, we look at this whole entity, we're the only shareholders, we say to ourselves, where do we go from here? And the very first thing is that we have to always ensure that we give our customers exceptional value and exceptional service. We also have to be fair to our suppliers. We always tell our staff, if anyone treats a supplier less than they would treat our best customer, they've broken company policy. And we try and be fair. And we are meticulous about trying to pay on time. We care for our employees. We look after them. They feel part of a family, and we really and truly trust them. And of course, we have respect for sustainability. We've won awards overseas for our sustainable garments that we produced. We've planted thousands of trees on the garden route after the fires that devastated everything. We believe that particularly our business, we want to ensure that we create an environment for future customers by looking after our environment as precious as it is. And then, of course, we have to make a contribution to society. And once again, Pick and Pay, TFG, Woolworths are outstanding examples of enormous contributions made to the betterment of society. Of course, I'm also thrilled to have had another daughter who's now recently gone to New York and joined a venture capital fund. She was literally headhunted and poached, but it's a great opportunity for her. She introduced our e-commerce side, which has grown out of all proportion. And I think we're one of the leaders in that field today. And we miss her greatly, but don't worry. She went to the beach in somewhere in the States today and sent me back pictures of a new umbrella which couldn't be blown over in the wind and said, Dad, you've got to get this. So they're still there. And my eldest daughter, Martine, is very much involved in the business. She's director of the company. She is absolutely involved in every aspect. Great advice to me, and just love having her there and love having that family continuing as we move forward. We do have an outside CEO who we brought in, who's done some excellent work in the company. And of course, we look at the issues of where do we go from here? And those are challenges for us, and we will be facing and addressing those challenges in the future. I should also perhaps just mention to you that when you have myself as an owner, so integrally tied to the business, it can create certain problems. I have been accused by certain elements of the Muslim community for being, quote unquote, the biggest donor to the Israeli army. Well, firstly, we're proud to be a bigger donor to Israel, but to my knowledge, our company has never given to anyone outside South Africa. And in my personal capacity, we have donated funds indeed for humanitarian purposes in Israel. And we're very particular about that. So we had a demonstration on Saturday morning outside our waterfront store, screaming down with Cape Union Mart, down with Philip Krawitz, all sorts of accusations. And that's what you've got to put up with. But I just want to make it perfectly clear. I will never, ever be ashamed of being a Jew. I'm a very proud Jew. I will never, ever be ashamed of my support for the state of Israel, because I believe in the existence of the state of Israel with all my heart. And as far as I'm concerned, the challenges that come to us, and I think we will face more in South Africa, have to be met head on, as we will do. So that's just a quick look inside Cape Union Mart, what we do, how we grow, and we're still having a lot of fun. Thank you.
So Philip, I want to actually tell you my favorite story, because one day, probably about 10 years ago, I barely knew you and I bumped into you in Cape Town, didn't really know what to say to you. So I mentioned to you, I had just been into a Cape Union Mart store looking for something and I couldn't find it. And you said, of course we stock it. Pulled out your phone, got on, checked the stock. The next day I got an email from you to say, this is where it's available. You can go purchase it here. A small little deal from someone almost irrelevant in your life, but you took the time and the effort to make sure that the sale was done. And that, I think anyone who's ever walked into a Cape Union Mart store has had that exact same experience, that you are the center of the world of whoever you're dealing with in any of your stores.
Well, Howie, just to tell you, only I think it was on Friday, I got a call from a very disgruntled customer. His name was Gareth Ackerman, who told me that he couldn't find his favorite quarter neck sweater. So immediately I got onto it. I think we located some. I contacted Gareth and said it's available in your Constantia store. That will never leave us. We are smosers, we are traders. We take our businesses very, very personally. And I think that, this is what we realize as Jewish traders. It's more than just the profit at the end of the day. It's about actually doing something productive in society and serving a need. And if we serve those needs, and if we understand the whole concept of the consumer is queen, started by Raymond and his 4 legs of the table and things like that, that's the way that we'll do it. And I remember seeing seeing Raymond walking around his stores. And I still remember Ernst Lubenberg from Woolworths. I bumped into him in Adderley Street one day, and there he was walking, hands behind his back, bent over. Hi, Ernst, what are you doing? He says, just watching how they're stuffing up my business. And that was the way that we took it. That was how business was. And I think it's a tribute to all of us that it will never be too small an issue. We care.
So first of all, there's been huge response to what you just said. Thank yous coming in from Martine Derschlewitz, from YouTube, from Andrea Morris, great program, from Yakov Kutsia. Thanks, Philip, you make us all so proud. But Simon, tell us, what is the special sauce that Cape Town has that so many of these remarkable businesses began there rather than in Johannesburg?
You're asking me that, Howie. But first, I'm going to tell you a story about real competition. So, and this is tough stuff. So about 10 years ago, Raymond Ackerman went to my daughter's school, who was then, I think, 6 or 7 years old, and told the story of Pick and Pay to her class. And they were all sitting on the floor listening to the great retail guru. And at the end, Raymond says to all these little girls, now, I hope all of you shop at Pick and Pay. Please put your hand up if you all shop at Pick and Pay. So they all put their hand up, except for my daughter, Isabel. She sits there with her hand down. And Raymond says to her, why don't you shop at Pick and Pay? She says, I'm not allowed to. My daddy won't let me shop at Pick and Pay. So I don't know if that's the secret sauce, but it's a great town. And I think that industry, on a more serious note, industries grow up around each other. And I think there's a great truth in that. So all of our grandparents knew each other. As Philip says, he knew most of that generation. I knew most of that generation. They knew each other. They watched each other. They competed with each other. And I think they challenged each other. So yes, we grew up in Cape Town. And I think that is the heart of South Africa's retail industry. And although there are others in different parts of the country doing well, the heart of it was Woolworths. And it came out of these Jewish families that wanted to do better than the other one.
So Gareth, does a business reach a scale whereby it can no longer be a family business, that you have to hand over to professional managers and the best that you can find?
Well, firstly, I wasn't a disgruntled customer of Philip. I would just happen to be chatting to you and asked you a question. But anyway, thank you for organizing it for me. I haven't been there yet. I will get there in the next day or so.
And if you don't, he's coming after you, I tell you.
No, I know that's the problem. I've known Philip for a long time. He won't let me off. But to answer your question, I think you've got it's a really long and complicated answer, but I think scale is important up to a point. It's also if you're listed or not. At a certain point, when you are listed, it's very difficult to then make sure that you have a family member, both as a CEO and as a chairman. You've got a lot of smaller minority shareholders. And, you know, a friend of mine often says to me, it's a statistical miracle if your son is the best person in the world to be the CEO, the next CEO of Pick and Pay. So I think you have to go out and you have to go and look at the market. You look at your family, you look internally, you look globally, and you find the best person to run your business. If it so happens to be a family member, so well and good. But I do think with a family-controlled business, you need to keep either the CEO or the chairman a family member, because that keeps the culture within the business. But increasingly, particularly if you're a listed business, you can't run it as a family business. You can keep the values and what have you in the company. But in terms of corporate governance, you have to comply with the highest standards of corporate governance in the country and probably in the world. And we do everything to make sure that we comply. Because if you don't, you've got the shareholders and particularly the institutions on your back all the time. To answer the question on Cape Town slightly is, Cape Town basically became the retail hub. And that's, as Simon says, it's where people tend to start businesses together, partially because the clothing industry was largely based down here. And my father came here because he was trying to get away, as far away as he possibly could, from the headquarters of OK and Checkers, which were up in Joburg at the time. But if you look at a lot of the Jewish companies, for example, in the mining industry, they all happened to be based in Joburg. That was because that's where the minerals were. So a lot of it was circumstances as opposed to anything, any specific plan.
I'll come to you in a second. I just want to tell Simon that his sister just emailed me from the UK to say that she saw someone had mentioned that their father had saved your father and she wanted to be in touch. So just to read a message that said, Stephen Furrer said, my father, Lockie Feynman, was a medic in the Machal and rescued your dad after being shot. I will definitely put the two of them in touch with each other. Sorry, Philip, you were saying something.
I just wanted to make another comment because all of these businesses grew out of families. And I just want to ensure that we don't fail to pay tribute to the women of the families in business. I always said that in most of these businesses, the wife of the founder or the CEO at the time was also a CEO, the chief emotional officer, trying to keep peace in the company between the fathers and the sons and making peace wherever they go. I had all three of my daughters involved at some stage in the business. Take Pick and Pay. I mean, Wendy's been on the board for years. Suzanne performs an outstanding role in the business as well in terms of outreach, etc. And certainly, I think that many of us have to thank those women who were the mothers, who were the ones who would comfort you at home when you came home and threatened that your overdraft was about to be called up. They were the ones who looked after the home so that you could focus, who made supper for you late when you came home. And I really think we've got to pay tribute to the women in the family businesses today.
And of course, Gareth, your sister Suzanne, who won the Jewish Achiever Awards, Woman in Leadership Award last year, during the period of COVID, was absolutely astounding in the way she took hold of Pick and Pay's response to COVID and what she did in that regard.
Absolutely, and they did an amazing job, her and all of them. And Philip's right about the women. My mother was always an executive director of Pick and Pay and is still intimately involved.
So, Michael, let's talk about succession for the Foschini Group. Are there still more nurses involved in the business?
So just before I answer that, I see one of the questions is the genesis of the name Foschini, and people wonder about, and Philip, it was in your summary as well, whether it was named after 4 Jews, 4 Shinis. The answer to that is no, it wasn't. It was actually named after, well, the best story we've got. It was named after an Italian general, Foschini, who was apparently very elegant and wore his clothes were very well cut, his uniform and so on. And Eric Rosenthal chose the name for that reason. So actually the Foschini story isn't correct, as amusing and appealing as it might sound. The other thing I wanted to just say, I think, Gareth, you're absolutely right about how I think the Johannesburg thing was all about mining and finance. And of course, the notable exception, retail exception, was of course Edgar's in Johannesburg and OK Bazaars. Really Johannesburg was a high finance mining. It was in a sense a more elitist group. And I certainly know that my father thought about being in the schmutter business as something that, at least he began thinking that way and was determined to change it, was that was kind of all he could do and all his father could do. And he was therefore very determined to professionalize and bring science to it, which accounted for the heavy emphasis on planning and logistics and technology more broadly, and of course is now informing the entire digital push, which of course none of us have even spoken about today for just time constraint reasons. That's a whole another question. In terms of succession, I agree with Gareth. I think I think there are 2 parallel thoughts I have about it. One is the point Gareth's made, is that you just simply have to find the best people to run the business. It's as simple as that. If you must do the right thing by the business, beginning and end. And statistically, to have somebody running the business who happens to be in your gene pool, it's quite remote. I mean, in addition to that, I think that, that this is a philosophy about how you bring up kids. But in addition to that, I think it's the job of any parent is to try and encourage their children to be the best versions of themselves. And so I have a daughter who's just about to complete her PhD in psychology, and another one is a documentary movie maker. I have a son who is in the business with me, but in the non-Foschini TFG side of our interests. We have a retail business in Australia. He spent 3 years there, and he's now intimately involved in the digital platform we've set up as an extension of our Australian business in the UK. So I can certainly see the role of family. In fact, I think it's crucial in the governance of a family, the governance of the processes that lead to creative entrepreneurial decisions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that person is going to land up in a senior position in one of the great public companies that all of the businesses we're talking about are, and even Philips is, even though he's 100% owned. So not necessarily is the answer, but that's not, I don't think, either a bad or a good thing. I just think it's a thing, and the right answer for the business emerges.
So as we bring the evening to a close, I'd like to ask each of our panelists one last question. And that is, there's so many young people watching us tonight. There must be one nugget of business advice that you'd like to give to people of what do you do? What makes you special? When you pitch something, how do you pitch it? What makes you stand out? If there's one piece of advice you would give to the people watching this evening who may be at the start of their careers, maybe Simon, I know you've been involved in business schools yourself. Maybe we start with you on the one nugget of advice you'd give to someone watching.
I think it's probably seek the truth. Seek the truth. And I think that's what a lot of retail is. Seek the truth. We all admire each other's businesses. I shop all of these companies. I shop in particular Philips business because I can get the right advice. But the right advice and the right product come from this depth of passion and obsession to get the product absolutely right for the customer. And to do that, you need to seek the truth. And I've just listened to one of the biographies of Elon Musk. It's quite a remarkable personality. And he talks about get to the science of things, understand it. So it's not just seeking the truth in a sense of technical truth or scientific truth. It's seeking the truth in moral truth. And I listened to all of these businesses. We've all played roles in helping to change this country. It's about our people. What do we mean to them? What does the business mean to them? What do the customers mean to them? It's about our customers. What is the truth for our customers? We're putting a lot of effort into this good business journey. Are we greenwashing, or can we actually follow up with what we say we can do? So that would be my challenge to a young person. And when I listen to all of these stories, all of these founders sought their own truth, and many of them ended up leaving the organizations they were in because they couldn't find their truth in that business. They created it for themselves.
So, Michael Lewis, as you create and continue to create your new truth, what advice do you give to the younger emerging generations?
And I think in business, probably two. I mean, there are lots of things, obviously, and you've spoken about Gladwell, Gareth. There's so many books you can read, and so many wise people have opined on this issue. But I guess there would, if we condensed period of time, I guess I would say two things. First is, if you want to be in business, as opposed to owning assets, but being in business, develop your people skills, because they are everything. They're the barometer of your success. They're also the compass of your direction. Your people skills are fundamental to the ability to lead a business or progress through a business. I think that's the first point. The second point is, leave your ego at home. Business is not, in our experience anyway, a place for egos. It is, you want to express an ego as opposed to your individuality. That's a different point, but your ego, then go to Hollywood. But business is about team playing, collective, doing things together. You can't achieve anything by yourself. I don't care what anybody says. It's a collective effort. So egos have to be left at the door, and people skills have to be accentuated to the nth degree. Those are the two comments that I would make.
Gareth Ackerman, what advice do you give down the line of Ackermans and to everyone else watching?
It's difficult after what Simon and Michael had actually put out there, because I'd agree with everything that they've said. My father Raymond often used to say, if you're going to look for a business, you're going to start a business, go where the tea's being made. He said it's very difficult to start a business from scratch. Find somewhere. That's why he went and bought 4 small stores in Cape Town. The other thing I always listen to that he said, which I think is absolutely right, which is just focus on a pinhead. The problem with a lot of people who are trying to start businesses is they're trying to have maybe 2, 3, 4 businesses at a time. And you can never put all your focus on one. I know I spent a number of years running a little private equity business and focusing on 4 or 5 businesses. The smaller the business, the more the amount of work needs to be put into it. The bigger the business, it basically, because you got the people, because you got the focus, they tend to be able to run themselves more. So it's actually focus on the detail. Make sure your product is unique. Make sure you're not just creating me-too products of inferior quality, because A, the retailers don't want to stock them, and B, you're not creating any value for your potential customers. So I've been far more basic than the theories of my 2 predecessors, but I think what they're saying is absolutely right. But it's just focus is really the message. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So Philip, tonight could not have happened without you. This all began because you sent me a paper that you had written, a speech you had given on the great Jewish retailers. And there's so many names we've never mentioned tonight. And people in the comment section have been putting additional people I've never even heard of, and businesses I've never even heard of, but our community has really built the retail sector in South Africa. And therefore, for all your help and putting this illustrious panel together and putting us all in touch, I'm enormously grateful to you. And that's why the last word tonight is yours, because I know you mentor so many people that we are all here to be mentored this evening by your final words of wisdom. So tell us what advice you would give.
Well, thank you, Howie. I'm actually going to give you two little bits of advice. The one is a wonderful book I read called The Discipline of Market Leaders. And it says, if you want to be successful, you just have to do three things, three very simple things. Number one, choose your customers. Instead of saying, these are my products, who can I sell them to? Define who the customers are that you want to service. Number two, narrow your focus, decide exactly what you want to do for those customers. Number three, dominate your market, be the gorilla in the patch in that area. And I think that if you look at all of the three businesses, the three other businesses mentioned tonight, I think that they have all done exactly that. They know exactly who their customer is. They've chosen their customer. They know exactly what they want to do for that customer, and they dominate their markets. The second is a bit of personal advice. That's something which I really live by and try and inculcate into all of our people. And it's a little dictum which came from Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce fame, where he said, take that which is good and make it better. Take that which does not exist and create it. Strive for perfection in everything that you do. Never accept anything nearly right or good enough. And I believe that that's what we all need to aspire to. And finally, I just want to pay a huge tribute to Howie. Howard, how you came up with this idea when life dealt us the lemons of COVID, you came up with lemonade, with the sweetest tasting lemonade that I've ever come across. You have enriched so many of us. You have helped so many people. You have given us something to do in our evenings. You've given us new interest, and you've exposed us to new dimensions and so many things that we never knew. And I really think that this whole community owes you Man of the Year award for the incredible job that you've done. So thank you from me.
Thank you. Well, let us say Michael Kallenbach has said, I've watched the previous 99 programs, but this one was certainly the best. So to our remarkable panel this evening, thank you for sharing your wisdom, really with thousands and thousands of people who've watched us this evening. I think the stories that you've told have resonated because in essence, they've been about determination, they've been about grit, they've been about execution, but they've been most importantly about passion. And I think when you look at the four of you, the passion for your business and for your customers absolutely shines through. So I want to ask everyone who's still watching us this evening, and I see we've barely dropped anyone over 2 hours and 20 minutes of this broadcast. I want to ask all of you just to leave a little comment for all of our remarkable retailers this evening. And if you haven't told us which webinar you've enjoyed most of all over the last 100 that we've done, please leave us a comment in the comment section as well. We're going to leave it open for a next 5 minutes or so. And if you haven't joined the Jewish Reports patron program, we're going to show you or give you the opportunity one last time to do that before we say goodnight to all of you. So to our remarkable panelists, a massive thank you. Thank you for your wisdom. And to all of you who've watched us this evening, we hope you have been as inspired as I certainly have by listening to these true greats of South Africa. Good night. Thank you. We'll see you all again later in the week. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.